Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome back to another edition of ZEFE Today's Opening. Today's guest is DIVO PULITIKA, fund manager at InterCapital Asset Management, the largest independent investment manager in Croatia with assets of 550 million euros under management. DIVO, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning and thank you very much for having me.
To set the scene for the discussion, to say so, please give us a brief overview of the international macroeconomic context and the evolution of capital markets in this context.
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, an interesting year or a couple of years, we can say so, starting back when we had COVID and the pandemic and so on, and the following, war in Ukraine, inflation that followed, hiking interest rates. I would say all of this pretty much stabilized this year. So if we look throughout this year, globally, the inflation seems to be under control. So, for example, if we look at the US, the expected inflation for this full year is somewhere below 3%, and the expectation for next year is 2.3%. That's the consensus on Bloomberg. Europe also looks good. So the consensus for this year, 2.4%, for the next year, 2%. Both economies with rising GDPs, the US somewhat faster than the EU, but still it's positive. However, if we look at how all of this impacts the markets, we will see that there is not actually a big correlation in the last weeks or months. And as you may guess, the main reason for this is the upcoming or the yesterday's election in the US. Most of the market is actually anticipating and expecting to see what happens. And then depending on this, they will react. Part of the market participants has already decided to, for example, take some positions that prepare them for the outcome, or if they see it as a closed draw, so they don't know which way to go, then they decided maybe to hold some investments to see how it goes. And you will see later on, I will mention also how this impacted Romania. So this was very obvious on your domestic market as well. So going forward, what will be important globally, obviously, is the outcome of this election. Most analysts are in a consensus that Trump win, Trump being the president, will be more favorable to the equities market than Kamala Harris being president. Of course, we'll see all of this, but depending on the outcome, probably the stock market will react accordingly.
Let's see today what will be the result, who will be the winner of the elections. How do you see the Bucharest Stock Exchange at the moment? How do investors seem to be trading and why?
So if we look at Bucharest and compare turnovers this year, for example, we will see that as of July, so July, August, September, and October, the latest statistics by the stock exchange show 40% less turnover than in the same period last year. So we would expect the summer to be somewhat slower. People go to vacation, so do fund managers. But I and perhaps other investors as well were surprised to see such low turnovers in September, October, and even now November seems to be slower than the previous year. What I mentioned before about the US elections, this plus a couple of more, I would say, geopolitical risks might be the reason behind this. So Romania, if you talk to any of the foreign investors, they still see it pretty close to Ukraine, Russia. So any kind of uncertainty about what happens there will obviously be translated to their view of Romania. As you may have followed, Trump said some things about not supporting Ukraine as much in the future. So perhaps this is kind of the reason why the international investors are holding back on Romania at this moment. Secondly, let's not also forget that Romania has its own elections upcoming. It's obviously globally, it's of much smaller importance than the US, but locally it could bring some changes that the investors consider important, and some of them are actually waiting to see how it ends up and what kind of changes are introduced. So as I said, if we look at this year as a whole on the Bucharest Stock Exchange, the turnover, equity turnover, is up by some 10%. However, if we were to split this period in the first 6 months and everything that happened afterwards, the first 6 months were almost double than the previous year. So the year seemed to be going extremely well. The other 4 months are actually 40% down. So all in all, this gives us a 10% growth in terms of volumes this year. And this, I would say, can be pretty much attributed to large institutional investors. What is very interesting in Romania, and it's a trend that's actually being translated from global markets, but especially Europe, is the larger demand of retail, especially for ETFs. So if we look at the ETFs that are traded on the Bucharest Stock Exchange this year, the volumes are up by 300%. So this actually tells us that retail investors are still more than happy to invest, and especially invest in kind of a long-term, so doing a long-term view and long-term investments rather than playing, day by day.
So then, what do you think are the long-term prospects of the Romanian equity market?
Well, you know that last year we introduced the Romanian ETF, we listed it in Romania. So obviously this can be seen as a signal of how we see the market going forward. Romania is, we believe, one of the stars in Europe, and history has shown that, but we believe that there is more potential in the future. We will see short term, as I say, probably there might be some volatility, especially depending on how US elections turn up, or what happens between Russia and Ukraine and so on. But if we take a longer term view, I believe that Romania is in a very good position. So if we just look at the composition, let me focus on the general index bet. It's mainly comprised out of energy companies, so Hydroelectrica, Petrom, and the likes. And if we look at Romania as what it is, it's actually one of the rare countries in Europe, at least in terms of gas, that might be a net exporter once that Neptune Deep goes online. It would be very important for Europe, and I believe that energy prices are always volatile, but if you have such huge quantities coming, so those companies will profit from volumes alone. The prices are less important in that regard than they are today, for example. The other part of the other large chunk of the index is banks, so Banca Transilvania and BRD Bank, and they are pretty much connected to the general Romanian economy. So this plus the interest rate environment, actually, which is at this point close to ideal, we could say. So it's high interest yield, interest rates actually on the loans that they give. There are no problems in the economy, so people and companies can return their loans. So it's ideal for a bank. If our expectation for the Romanian economy does come true and that continued growth in the future, we believe even these banks will profit out of it. And the third part of the index is actually, we call it entrepreneurial or smaller companies, which are small in weight, but actually present the potential of Romania, kind of a proof that Romania is not only the companies that were previously state-owned or monopolies that came to the stock exchange, but there is like a growing community of entrepreneurs who are coming to the exchange and actually making the market grow in this way, adding more and more opportunities there. So definitely, we see Romania in itself as a good market to be long-term. And also we see Romania as a market that will invest more and more in the future. So Romanians, for example, through the local ETFs have already shown their interest. They already show interest if you look at statistics on how much Romanians use platforms such as Revolut and how much they invest through it on the foreign markets. And also we believe Romanians will show more and more interest in the new products that even we plan to bring on the exchange.
About the entrepreneurial companies and about your ETF on BET-TRN index, recently the composition of BET total return and BET total return net indices has been changed by excluding the Bucharest Stock Exchange and Compet and including Antibiotice and Premier Energy. You also wrote an analysis on the subject at the end of October, given that ETF of InterCapital Asset Management is traded on the Bucharest Stock Exchange and tracks the evolution of BET-TRN. How did you view these things, or how was it from the perspective of an administrator who also tracks Romania? And I don't know, on the other hand, what is the impact of dividends on dividends and the outlook for companies have been included and excluded?
Well, the change in itself was small. So from the point of view of the ETF administrator, it was not that important. And from the point of view of those investing in the ETF, it was not that important. So the entire rebalance of the index, so rebalance of the existing companies plus the addition of 2 new and excluding the ones you mentioned, all of this actually changed only 5% of the index of the ETF. So I would say almost a marginal change there. In terms of the dividend yield, also this was not a big impact. So it changed the yield by only 10 basis points, so 0.10%. Romania is still, I wouldn't say extremely high, but very high in terms of dividend yield. We are seeing about 6%, and I believe this will be similar, if not a bit more, even next year. But yeah, in terms of, as I said, the change to the index, it was not that important. What was important with this is actually the proof that new companies, growing companies, can find their way in the official index. And if you look at it from a point of perspective of the company, or even better, from the point of an international investor who is considering Romania, the way they start usually, when you're looking at a new market, you very often start with the main index. So anyone taking a first view at Romania would look at BET, see that there are 20 companies, and do some kind of an analysis of those companies. Because being part of the main index means that there is someone, in this case the exchange, who says, okay, these are the best companies that we have on our market. They are relatively liquid. They are, good with reporting and so on. So this is kind of a safeguard for investors in that way. So even though companies like Antibiotice or Premier Energy, maybe they didn't see huge inflows just because they became part of the index at this moment, in a longer term, they will surely come to the center of attention of more and more investors, and they will actually have a chance to present themselves. So I see it from that point as well. And this is why I think it's good for those companies to be part of BET. And I think more Romanian companies should aim for this status.
Giving the context for this year and the financial reporting so far, what do you expect the dividend out of this year's profit to be?
I mean, this will also depend on the results of the elections and in which way actually the government decides to fill the hole, so to say. That Romania is facing a double deficit. So in some way, the authorities will have to, at some point, try to close this. One of the ways that that would be beneficial for all the investors, I would say, would be just asking for higher dividends from these companies. And I think definitely there is potential in some of them. If we are looking at results alone, we are still waiting for the third quarter, but if we analyze the first semester of this year, most heavyweights, so to say, in the index had, I would say, amazing results. Both Banca Transilvania and Petrom, the highest weighters, their profits more than doubled. Romgaz also had a good result of about 10% increase in their profit. The only laggard so far among the larger companies was Hydroelectrica, and this was obviously partly due to the bad hydrological season, so the lack of rain, so to say, during the summer months. But I still think, looking at the index overall, there would be room for growth in dividends. I wouldn't expect anything huge, but maybe like 5 to 10% per company would be achievable. Of course, there are some exceptions such as Hydroelectrica, where I think we might even see something less. Also, we'll see the results of Nuclear Electrica. Their profits have gone down in the first semester, and they are usually a heavy payer of dividends. So we'll need to wait for the second half of the year. But overall, so far, I am optimistic that dividends will not go down, and I still think they will go up to a point. The second thing I mentioned about the upcoming elections and the results, also we'll see what happens to, for example, dividend taxation and general taxation of the companies. So if these companies believe that in some short to medium term, they will have actually more liabilities towards the government in terms of taxes, they might decide to be less generous in terms of dividends. But let's wait for the election and see what happens.
Okay. What are your plans next? Are you preparing for anything else of interest for Romanian investors?
Yeah, actually, as I mentioned before, we want to introduce more ETFs to the Bucharest Stock Exchange, and we have already applied with the regulator for the first among them, that's the Slovenian ETF. So we decided to go with this one first because it's in a way similar to what Romanians are used to. So it's a country with a very high dividend yield, actually even higher than Romania at this point, more than 6%. And the price to earnings is a bit lower than Romania. So those two main points that many Romanians look at will be familiar, and I think they will see value in Slovenia as well. So yeah, Slovenia will be our first one. We are hoping to have it there in the next couple of months. I wouldn't talk about the exact date until we get any kind of regulatory approval and the stock exchange decides for themselves.
Keep in touch. Giva, what are the other trends do you see at the European level? When will you see, for example, return from value to growth stocks again? Or is it happening already?
Well, there is this continuous discussion about value to growth. Pretty much whenever I talk to it, any year, the question is value to growth. This year specifically, or maybe in the last 2 years, growth has become AI, I would say. And then if you look globally, you would see a lot of shift towards what some people would call growth. But in fact, it's a big correlation to the AI companies. Whether it's the direct companies that directly offer AI services, such as the information IP sector in the US, which has been one of the largest beneficiaries so far this year, so the large tech. Whether it's some companies that are not traditionally using AI services, but are expected to profit from it in a way. So maybe if they can better manage their costs, better communicate with their users, and so on. So this is the value, the increased interest in value that we see. And then if we look at where most of these companies are that are benefiting from AI, it's mostly the US. And okay, also some Asian companies. So it's mostly those markets that benefit from growth at this point. Europe is maybe, let's say, more traditional, but not only traditional in terms of what investors want, but also traditional in terms of what we offer. So in Europe, there are no big companies that offer AI at this point. So this is why I think investors are in a way maybe even forced to look at value, because finding growth is difficult in Europe currently. However, if we look at where Europeans like to invest, we see that this year, for example, the demand for ETF has grown tremendously. So if we look at just the first 10 months of the year, Europeans have actually invested more than 110 billion euros into ETFs, so ETFs listed in Europe. And that's significantly more than that, almost 50% or 40% more than last year, and even more than any previous year ever on record in Europe. And we've only seen the first 10 months, so there are still 2 months to go. What is, again, interesting in Europe is that most of these ETFs target markets that are outside of Europe. So most Europeans prefer to invest in S&P, for example, or in some global ETFs and so on, because this is where they see growth in the future. Another reason why I would say a lot of Europeans don't pick European ETFs is that Europe is not that well covered in terms of ETFs as the US is. In the US, you can find an ETF for pretty much everything. In Europe, this is not the case. So we believe there are still pockets of values in Europe which can be turned into ETFs and attract interest in that way. So Romania and Slovenia definitely among them.
Okay, one last question, Givo, to conclude our discussion. What should investors look out for? What to consider when choosing their investments?
If someone is already investing and is interested in what to look at in short term, obviously the results of the election are important there. We will see how this plays out, but as I said, the consensus is pretty much that Trump winning will be more beneficial to stocks, at least in the short term. In the long term, what we keep telling our clients, especially the retail clients, is with equities, if you want to invest into equities, be prepared for this to be a long-term story. So with ETFs and with new ways of investing, such as fractional shares and so on, you can start investing at any point and pretty much take into account how much you can actually invest. Don't go above your own means, but a steady kind of investment, if you make it a habit to invest every month, for example, a part of your salary, and then in the long term, this so far historically this has always been a good decision. So this is what we would tell anyone. Don't be afraid of investments. However, start with something diversified, I would say. What we talk about very often are the so-called core to satellite strategies, core being you picking a kind of an investment that's diversified, that can be the core of your portfolio, right? Most investors pick the S&P 500, for example, for this. And then once you get more ideas, pick your own satellites. So the satellites that we offer, for example, are BET, so Romanian equities through ETFs, Slovenian equities. We also cover more, and I hope that we will be able to present them to Romanian investors. So.
Okay, thank you so much for taking part, Givo.
Thank you for inviting me.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. That concludes ZFE today's opening edition. Joining me was DIVO PULITIKA, fund manager at InterCapital Asset Management. Thank you. See you next time.
Știu ce spun.
Un nou val de explozie a lovit Libanul. Pac! Faci material explozibil în device-uri, un serviciu secret până la urmă eficient.
Știu ce te interesează.
În spatele fiecărui ambalaj de plastic se ascund riscuri care ar putea să-ți afecteze sănătatea.
Avem plastic și în apă, și în mâncare, și în noi.
Știu cum să te fac curios.
Pentru influencer mesajul e clar. You shall not pass.
Mi se pare o ușoară ipocrizie acolo.
Când lucrurile devin deranjante, este evident că trebuie să-și ia și niște măsuri.
Știu cum să te emoționezi.
Ciclonul Boris nu a iertat nici România. 6 persoane au murit și 2 sunt date dispărute. Nimic nu a stat în calea apelor, mașini, animale sau case.
Știu să conving.
Neuralink a creat un nou device experimental numit Blindsight. Tu, care ți-ai pierdut vederea, vei putea vedea din nou.
E caz real ce ai văzut zilele astea în Liban. Cât de predispus ai fi să fii hackuit?
Știu să câștig.
Știu pe ce lume trăiesc.
Știu, deci știi.